Blog Talk Radio.
Carol the Coach. Sex, love, and relationships. We talk about it here.
Carol the Coach. Compassion with contemporary relevance.
I am a psychotherapist. I can be your personal life coach, and I can help you with your issues. There are no problems too small or too big. You can talk about anything.
Speaker, columnist, radio TV host, and commentator. Carol the Coach brings messages of wellness and empowerment within reach of everyday people every day.
Almost 5 years ago, I lost my soulmate in an accident. He was killed in a plane crash. Life just, for me, has seemed to stop.
There are groups all over the city. I teach one. It is a specific way to start thinking so that you shift how you see the world, which then shifts your energy, and then you feel better and you actually see things differently.
Carol the Coach. Always available, too, at carolthecoach.com.
Now, I've got Russell on the line.
I'm 47 years old. I'm a truck driver. I'm married. I have a wife in San Francisco.
Okay.
I haven't been home in 6 months. My thing is, I don't know if I have a sex addiction or what the problem is. Why do I want what I can't have? And as soon as I can have it, I don't want it anymore.
You're right on target when you say, I don't know if I have a sexual addiction. Well, guess what? Yes, you do. And you know what? That's my specialty, Russell, so you're at the right place. Continue.
I meet women online, and I'm in a different part of the country. I travel all 48 states, so I love sex.
I hear self-esteem issues. You never felt good enough, and you didn't feel like you were getting what you should have then, and you're reenacting that now. Do you want to change that about yourself?
You get what you need. Boy, that is the $10 million question, and we all know that, oh my goodness, it is so important to ask yourself, do you want to change? Because that is the first key to sexual addiction recovery. Do you want to change? And then it's up to you and your therapist, hopefully a certified sexual addictions therapist, to decide what's the best way to go about it. You've heard me say before that it's imperative that you follow at least 8 of the 10 recovery tools. And so oftentimes we look at sexual addiction from 2 different pathways. And tonight we're going to be talking specifically about one of those pathways, and that is post-traumatic transformation. You know, I'm going to have Stacy Sprout on, and she's going to be talking about that process of healing when you've had post-traumatic stress and you've had post-trauma, and it's affected you in many ways that has helped to create the sexual addiction. A lot of people say, well, it might be considered trauma reenactment. In other words, you've had a trauma in the past, and as an adult, or actually as a teen and young adult, or a middle-aged or older adult, you choose a pattern of behavior that actually is trauma reenactment. It reenacts what you experienced at a younger age, and this time you fool yourself into believing that you're in control. Now, Stacy says some important things, and that's why I'm looking so forward to interviewing her at about 9:15. She talks about post-traumatic transformation, that it's a sacred process of healing the negative effects of trauma that's held in one's mind, heart, body, and spirit. And it involves learning to stop acting out of the trauma story that you lived at a younger age, and to interpret its language directly to empower the natural grief process. Because we all know that once somebody experiences trauma, they're actually robbed of something and they need to grieve. And she teaches about post-traumatic transformation and weaves her own story with her perspective as a therapist to describe how the natural grief process gets on hold by traumatic experiences. So I'm really looking forward to finding out more about that. That second pathway may not have anything to do with trauma. in actuality, what it may have to do with is something that we tend to look at as behavior repetition. You know, maybe it has something to do with obsessive-compulsive behaviors or anxiety, where you participate in something over and over and over again, and it gets out of control. And so that can be equally as devastating until you know what to do to stop the trauma. But tonight, what Stacy is going to be talking about is psychologically much more impactful. I mean, it has to do with childhood wounds, and it has to do with healing that trauma in very specific ways. So I'm excited to be talking to her, and you can look at her website tonight. It's www.stacysprout.com, and we're going to be talking here in about 10 minutes to Stacy. Hey, you know, I have so oftentimes felt like group work is imperative in healing the trauma. You know, so many of my group members experience many of the same issues, even though it happened differently. And so there's oftentimes childhood trauma that they're dealing with. And so when they get an overly critical spouse or an overly critical boss, it takes them back to the shame they experienced as a child. And as an adult, you have to learn how to reparent yourself and teach yourself how to say, hey, this was not your fault, you know, and ask yourself, was there a way that I contributed to the problem? And then oftentimes determine that there is a way, but it was just a fraction of what created the trauma. And then what you need to do is really be kind and gentle to yourself and say, okay, you know, I've got these kinds of behaviors and I don't like them. As a matter of fact, it's caused a lot of self-loathing. Here's what I can do to get back on track. You know, I had a client today who has not done the program perfectly. And he was really feeling down on himself. He said, I'm tired of not doing it exactly right. And another group member said to him, you know what, in our program, it's progress, not perfection. You're human, and you need to be softer and kinder and gentler to yourself. And interestingly enough, when he did that, he felt that inner sense of relief. I mean, he did it right there in the group, and he felt as if he had given himself permission to be imperfect and to get back on track faster. And that is what recovery is all about. We know there's going to be slips. That's when you engage in behavior that you don't like, but it's very short-lived. We know there's going to be relapses. That's when oftentimes the behavior lasts for hours, days, weeks, and it feels out of control, and then you get back on track. Regardless of which one that is for you, whether it's a slip or a relapse, it's important to figure out, what do I do to make my life better? And that's why we work with individuals, families, marital couples, and in group. And I got to tell you, I've got a lot of partners that contact me, and they say, what can I do to feel better and to build up that trust? Now, I often say there's two schools of thought on that. Sometimes people need to get healthier before they can participate in any kind of couples or family therapy. And sometimes they can move into couples therapy and family therapy right off the bat. So that's up to your counselor as to which degree that is for you. And that's a judgment call based on what your counselor believes therapeutically you're able to handle. I mean, some people have to develop more ego strength before they can deal with how they've impacted their partner. Other people need to be a part of that change quickly and effectively right off the bat. So let your certified sexual addictions therapist help you with that. And if you're looking for a certified sexual addictions therapist, go to sexhelp.com, put in your zip code, put in your state, your country, and it will give you a certified sexual addictions therapist who works close to your location. And if there is no one, you can check on the website and find out who does that by Skype, who can at least point you to the right directions, get you to the recovery tools that you need, and take it from there. Now you're listening to Sex Help with Carol the Coach. This show is about sexual addiction. It is the only show that you can access through iTunes, so we're very, very proud of that. And so right now, if you have sexual addiction, this is the only show through iTunes that you can find out more about your disorder or more about your partner's disorder. And you're on the right road to making a difference. So now I'm going to welcome my guest, Stacy Sprout, to the show. Stacy, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. You work with such an intensely important issue for a lot of sex addicts, and that is post-traumatic trauma. I mean, a lot of our clients have this trauma that they've never been able to heal as a child or young adult, and they've acted out as a result. So talk a little bit about trauma and also what you call post-traumatic transformation.
Well, post-traumatic transformation is an idea, and really in my mind and heart, I would love for it to be a movement. It's not a kind of therapy. It's a worldview. And it involves, as you said in the introduction, really a sacred process of healing the negative effects of trauma and taking responsibility for that healing as the individual, which I think is a key part of the healing. And so to answer the question, what is trauma, I would say I define trauma with 4 different points. So one point is that someone has a horrific experience that happens to them, either directly or indirectly. And as you know, as a therapist, one can be traumatized just by hearing a traumatic story. So it also, to me, I include trauma in the absence of needs being met. So neglect can be a form of trauma for people. And so this horrific experience affects individuals mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, sexually, maybe all of the above. And as a result, the person feels shocked and terrified and alone, and they feel trapped or stuck or helpless. And as a result, they feel at risk of psychic or physical overwhelm, or sometimes we say annihilation. And the thing that I add to the definition of trauma, which is really important to the concept of post-traumatic transformation, is that as a result of this shock, this horrific experience or series of them, the conscious mind is put on hold. And there's a protective internal threat response, I call the internal threat response team, that then takes over to manage the event from the conscious mind. So to me, all of those things are present when you have a trauma. And if you don't have...
let's just remind everybody that, there are 3 parts of the brain, and we file information in the conscious part of our brain, and that's the part that says, we're doing this because, I'm getting up at 5 o'clock because I have to go to work. And then there's the subconscious part of the brain that we file some information in there that we periodically forget, but oftentimes we pull it back out and use it when we need it. And then, of course, there's that unconscious part of the brain that we have no idea that we've stored memories, feelings, thoughts in that part of the brain, but it's also locked into the brain. So continue now as we explain what those 3 parts of the brain are.
Well, thank you. And what I would say is that I would call the subconscious the primary agent in the internal threat response team, kind of in that threshold where, but it depends. So to me, it's a great time to develop what I would call trauma intelligence, which is learning more about trauma and what are the parts of the brain and how things are stored, because so many disciplines are contributing to it and being curious about it. I mean, the diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, only came about in 1980. And that's not very long ago. And yet, you know, people today, especially young people, they know a lot about trauma. They're pretty trauma intelligent. And so we've studied with Patrick Carnes to get a CSAT, and the field of addictions has really led the way at looking at trauma and how the connections with addiction and trauma are so close. And there's another branch in neuroscience which is really talking about the different aspects of the brain. So looking at subconscious and unconscious processes that take over in trauma, and that is Stephen Porges and his work with the polyvagal theory. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. Go ahead and tell us about that.
Okay. Well, I'm going to summarize. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I have to break it down to help me understand it in a more simple way than he can explain it. But what I would say in looking at his work is that our nervous system is not so separate from our brain. There's the vagus nerve that runs down along the spine that really is very connected and has intimate and extremely rapid communication with the rest of our body. And so when humans are faced with threat, kind of like I had talked about those examples of trauma, then they respond in one of three ways, which he puts in a hierarchy based on his research. And this hierarchy is based on the development of the human brain over time, with our newest brain capacities in the neocortex first. And if safety is not achieved from that threat by the first category, then we move on to the second category. And this is what I call the threat response. It's a multi-layered team that is available to help people who are overwhelmed by traumatic experiences. And why this is important to post-traumatic transformation is that when people have trauma effects from things they've gone through, and I can say this in my own story, often the first feeling besides confusion is overwhelming shame. Like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I function? Why do I keep thinking about this thing over and over, or, as you mentioned, reenacting it in my addiction or my compulsions? And so by understanding that there's actually a trauma adaptation that's being played out that's protecting the conscious brain, then for me at least it was extremely empowering to say, oh, okay, this is an effect of the trauma, and this is my brain and nervous system trying to protect me. And so the first category is what he calls the relational category. And that's where you imagine a child and they're in a threatening situation, and if they have a trusting caregiver nearby, they might turn to the caregiver and look and see, does the caregiver attune to them? Are they making eye contact? Can they reassure them? Are they seeming to be okay? And so if the child sees, okay, that person's okay and I'm okay, then they might let go and not feel threatened and feel safe again. So that would be a classic example of a relational response to trauma. And that can be more conscious. It's in the neocortex, and we drum this into people in recovery. As you know, people in individual therapy and in groups, the therapists are always saying, did you call someone for support? Did you pick up the phone? And for trauma survivors, that phone may be the 2-ton phone because they tried this at the time of threat, and it didn't work. And so when it doesn't work to restore safety, then the nervous system goes to the next level of protection, and that is mobilization. So this would be the sympathetic nervous system, the mammal kicking in, the classic fight or flight, run away, hide, put up your dukes, you're going to defend yourself. And for many people, the threat is not stopped by those kinds of actions in trauma, and therefore they go to a third level, which is immobilization. And this is the play dead, the freeze response. this Porges gives a nice example. If you go into a pet store and there's a cage there with mice in it, and the mice are threatened, they run around like crazy. But if you have a snake or other reptile in a cage, they are frozen. I mean, they do not move. They may look at you, you may see a little tongue flickering out, but they are immobile. And that's the oldest part of our brain. And it connects with just playing dead in order to try to survive and stay safe. So as I've studied and looked at trauma, PTSD, and how it heals, I also feel like there's one more autonomic threat response category that I would add, and that is the dissociative category. And I think it needs its own category because we see it so much, particularly in recovery, say from sex addiction, people using dissociative or kind of a psychic ability, if you will, to deal with a traumatic experience. And so often people in recovery say, I feel like I'm living a double life, like I've got a split consciousness. It's me and then it's my addict. And recovery means that those two have to meet. But oftentimes there's a split and a derealization, like that doesn't seem real, I'm not really doing that, someone else is doing that, or just to prevent the conscious mind from being overwhelmed, there's some kind of internal psychic split of what's actually going on. And so much about recovery is about mending that split so that you don't have the compartmentalization that is, keeping the conscious mind safe. But ultimately, of course, as we see, if the things are enacted in addictions or other ways, it brings tremendous pain, tremendous harm. So that's what I mean by the internal threat response team.
Yeah, and what you're describing sounds so complex, but at the same time, I'm sure there's a lot of people that say, oh boy, that is me, and nobody's ever described it as disassociative. Would you be willing to share your own story so that we can hear how somebody's actual life experience transpired into one of these stages?
Sure. And what I would say is, so I'm a recovering addict, and my first experience with addiction was as a professional. Not my first experience, my first understanding of it. So as a professional, I got my master's in social work, and I was running my addictions, but in secret. So I didn't tell anybody about what was going on there. And so I lived my life and worked with people who are dealing with life losses in medical social work. And so I witnessed them having losses, and part of my role was to help people grieve. And at that time, I didn't realize that the main way I dealt with my own personal grief was by suppressing it, making it unconscious, and then acting out my addiction. So in studying what other people did, I started to see, wow, some people grieve in healthier ways than others, and I tried to use what I'd learned in school, at least, to help people grieve in a healthy way. But it wasn't until I bottomed out on my own addiction in 2001, which started with a fabulously toxic relationship and then revealed itself in compulsive behaviors with sex and love and money and alcohol and food, that I entered my own recovery. And this community of recovery really changed my life. Now, not everybody goes to 12-step programs in order to heal. But for me, as I got sober, my traumatic history began to reveal itself more, and I was quite overwhelmed. So I didn't understand that I'd had trauma, really. And so it wasn't until looking at this that I realized, there's not just grief here, there's frozen grief. Like, I've got deep stuff. And it was through the help of therapy that I started to look at, wow, there's this issue of grief and there's this issue of trauma, and how do they all go together? And so for me, 12-step recovery gave me the paradigm of my addict self. Like, you've got to stop that acting out. But it wasn't until I was in therapy that I started to have more of a concept of trauma, and that I was actually acting out something specific. It wasn't just random acting out. I was telling a story with my acting out, and not exactly what happened to me, but the emotional experiences that I had suppressed. And so those were dissociated at the time of trauma because they overwhelmed me. It was, started when I was very young. And so suddenly...
And may I ask what those were so that we can see the parallel between what you experienced and in some ways how you acted that out?
Sure. Well, I can tell you in a general way, I experienced extreme trauma, mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, and sexual. And so that was just part of how things were. And I really didn't remember a lot of it. And what I did start to remember, I used what I would say is a dissociative skill or threat protection of either denial or minimization. Yeah, that happened, but it didn't really affect me. And so an example is when I was 18, I went to go see a psychiatrist, and I was dealing with issues with food, young woman, body image, and I didn't really know what was, quote, wrong with me. But on some level, what was wrong with me, I have a quote that I say, which is, your psychiatric symptoms are the sanest things about you. And what I mean when I say that is, it's like a trail of breadcrumbs often leading to what the deeper issue is, this longing to heal. But I didn't know that, so I went to a psychiatrist and I said, can you give me Prozac? I would like a prescription for Prozac. It was pretty new at that time. And he said, okay. And he said some more things. It wasn't black and white, but basically he gave me the prescription and sent me on my way. And he had no idea that I was a survivor of mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, and sexual trauma, and neither did I. Right. So I had dissociated that, and, it took a long time. As I said, I got into my professional life, and I started seeing things, and suddenly it was reflected, and things started to become more real to me. And so that's an example of how the dissociative process protected me from overwhelm of what happened in my childhood. But then when I started to try to get help, I was searching for a pill. I wanted a really quick fix. And that's part of why I feel this passion about post-traumatic transformation, because it's not a quick fix.
Well, absolutely. And I want to ask you something, because initially when you were talking about that, what I thought you meant is that the dissociation could in actuality be, that dual experience that an addict has participating in behaviors that they're not really connected to. It's almost like a drive to participate in something, but they aren't socially, emotionally, spiritually, physically connected to that. And that's what I thought you meant at first, but as you told your story, it actually sounded like your disassociation resulted in you not having any initial memories that you could connect to a specific trauma or to the specific behavior. So is there that delineation there?
I would say, so this gets actually to something that's really important, which is dissociation has many, many facets. And so I would say both are true, and both have been true in my life. Earlier on, when I was closer to my childhood, I had suppressed it much, much more. As I eventually got into some therapy and started looking at things, then I started to look at parts of what was going on, but I didn't understand the significance of it. And then later, when I started realizing, wow, I'm acting out sexually among other compulsions, it was more of an addictive life process than any one particular addiction. But, for the sake of specialty, would say acting out sexually or with sex and love addiction, then it was this kind of derealization, depersonalization, which are dissociative protection methods, but that leave a person kind of semi-conscious. So if I'm acting something out, but I'm not conscious of really why I'm doing it, I just feel compulsive, like I have to do it. And so, and I hear that a lot. It's like, in one 12-step program, they have a whole pamphlet. It's called The Bubble, and the bubble of sexual addiction. And that, I think, is referring to the trance that people go into, a dissociative trance, where their conscious mind is just not really on board, but their subconscious is kind of running the show in terms of the meaning of what's going on. They're really disconnected to it. And then it's only in recovery that that people start to get a sense of where their conscious is, because the trauma kind of buried it. They couldn't really use their mind to think about what's going on because it was too overwhelming. So then in recovery we say, yeah, we got to get your conscience on board to start thinking this through, and let's start with safety. So let's stop, support you to stop the behavior, and in that safety place of sobriety, then we can see more consciousness and starting to look at what's how people define their sobriety, what's right and wrong for them, what is their sexual ethic.
Well, and part of that safety, obviously, is a certified sexual addictions therapist, maybe some group therapy, certainly 12-step work if you're a part of that, your sponsor, the fellowship. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to create safety, sometimes for the first time in a client's life.
Yes, I so agree. And that gets to more of the question of trauma intelligence. Like, what is that? What kinds of, more detail about what kind of traumas there are. And to me, the issue of how did the trauma occur, how frequently did it occur, did it happen one time in a single incident, which is much easier to heal, or was it a way of life? And I don't know about you, but the majority of the people that I have worked with, it was a childhood way of life trauma. It was not a single incident deal. And so doesn't it make sense that the recovery from that level of brain adaptation is going to take a way of life change also? And that's exactly what you're talking about. Groups, and you have some kind of reality check coach that knows about trauma like CSAT, and I also advocate when people are ready, body work, the support circle, getting educated. I mean, there's a lot to do. And if someone would have told me that when I was, I could say, if a politician would have tried to sell me that in my life, I wouldn't have voted for him. Who wants to hear that they have to change their whole way of life? But if you stop and think about how adapted the brain gets from way of life traumas, the complex ways that different kinds it occurs, and duration over time, so it's intermittent, so that safety can never quite get there in families. It just makes sense that it would be a new life path.
Oh, 100%. And, obviously, if I understand you correctly, it was the fact that almost there was this unconscious drive to do the work that you decided to do, at which point, as you started to help people with their issues, you realized you had trauma that you needed to work through, and then being a professional, you were able to access the resources you needed right off the bat. It was. I'm sure you went to a professional, but it was like deep down inside, you had this unconscious or subconscious drive to get you where you needed to be, to do your own healing, and then, of course, to even be a better therapist.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think a lot of therapists are drawn to helping people because they want to heal themselves, and I think there's a light side of that, which is it's really true. One of the best ways to heal is to be of service to others. And then the dark side of that, of course, is when we don't do our own work, we can just focus all our attention outward and then kind of act out our own unhealed traumas in our helping relationships. So I would say for me, when I first was looking for help, I didn't really know how to discern. I didn't know how to find a certified sex addiction therapist, or, so I did the best I could and found the people I found, and they did the best they could. But eventually, I've developed more discernment in choosing people to help me that really get trauma and really are able, when I'm confused, because, there's times where I'm still on the healing journey myself. I no longer have post-traumatic stress disorder, but that doesn't mean that every ounce of trauma and grief from my past is healed. And so if confusion comes up for me, I have support to turn to, and that's great. I'm very grateful for that. And I'm grateful for our field that we're getting more and more aware of the ties between trauma and how the unfreezing of that trauma when we feel safe enough then kicks off the natural grief process. So we do need to grieve. I love what you said, that some things are lost. They're lost. And then some things can be restored. They say it's never too late to have a healthy childhood, and I actually have really believed that. Do you have other questions? Are you there, Carol? I can't hear you if you're there.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, what I said was, yes, I wanted to know how you define trauma. You know, that's such a generic term, and I'm sure there's some listeners that are saying to themselves, I don't know if I've had trauma or not. So how do you actually define that?
Well, so here's what I would offer, and I mean, for some people, they may know, like, oh yes, I've had these several experiences, and or I grew up in this kind of family, and so they're fully aware. But usually, the conscious mind is protected from knowing the depths of the trauma. That's part of the threat response, and so it can be pretty difficult to figure out sometimes. Have I really had trauma? I don't know. And so I think it is helpful to see a therapist and a specialist to really get some assessment. I am a fan of that. But in terms of self-help or trying to understand that, you know, the first question I would say is, do you have symptoms or reactions that feel like they're coming from a subconscious place inside you that you don't consciously want to have happen? So whether that's compulsions or acting things out, or, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder is characterized by intrusivity. So nightmares or repetitive thoughts that don't go away, intrusive images of horrific things. There might be a fixation or fascination of some kind of, you know, movies that have a certain trauma theme. So do people have symptoms or reactions to things in their world that might be indicative of dark experiences in their past that they may or may not be aware of? So that would be, so anybody with compulsive behaviors, I would be very curious about. I would want to support them to rule out trauma as opposed to just, I'm just randomly compulsive. The next question I would ask...
if they're gambling, or if they're acting out sexually, or if they have an eating disorder, or if they're having difficulty sleeping because of chronic and compulsive nightmares, if they have some trauma responses where they get very, very anxious and they don't believe they can function, you would encourage them to go to a specialist and find out if they might be suffering from more than just the behaviors, but from trauma that induces the behaviors.
Exactly, because the thing about it is the problem was the trauma in the first place. And what you're describing are the symptoms of a brain that's been traumatized and it's adapted. So if those symptoms are occurring, then, you know, then it's about getting curious. It's like, well, why is this? You know, I mean, did I really come into the world like this, or did something happen? So getting very curious. That would be the first thing. And also, you know, this is part of what I believe about post-traumatic transformation is the individual really is in charge of their healing process. So they seek out the best therapist they can find, and they get an evaluation. And if it works for them, great. If not, then maybe they go to a different therapist and get another evaluation, or they go to another kind of practitioner. I mean, they really stay with themselves as a loving parent in order to find a solution to the suffering of the intrusivity or the compulsion or whatever's going on. So they hang in there with it until they start to get relief.
You know, we talked earlier, prior to you coming on the show, about going to sexhelp.com to find a certified sexual addictions therapist, but oftentimes people that are experts in trauma, that can be Googled by going to post-traumatic trauma, or even EMDR specialists that work with eye movement desensitization reprocessing, also are experts in trauma. So for our clients that are listening right now to the show, there are lots of people that deal with trauma. You've got the ability to at least Google and find out what people think of them, what their philosophy is, what does their website say. But that would be the first step. If you have those kind of intrusive compulsions, find yourself a specialist to at least do an assessment, correct?
I agree. But here's the piece about trauma intelligence trying to discern is that I think CSATs get this training, and I think by and large would probably have this context as part of their professional frame. But there is a huge difference between a single incident trauma, like a weather incident, like a huge, a tornado or a car accident, or things that can evoke symptoms of PTSD, and what I call childhood way of life traumas. So some of the trauma clearing or healing techniques, like EMDR, for example, are amazing with single incident traumas. But sometimes if people have high levels of dissociation, standard protocol EMDR is a little too soon. People need to work on stability first and safety first. And so that would be important for someone to know. And for the folks that we see who are in recovery from sex and love addiction and other addictions, I have found that unless sobriety is defined and achieved, then someone doesn't have enough safety in their life to start looking at the traumatic underpinnings of that, because they're still acting it out and suffering consequences. So it's not time to work on the trauma for people in active addiction until they can achieve some level of safety through sobriety. Well, actually, that is working on the trauma, but it's not time to go deeper, delving deeper into it. It's working at the trauma, whatever level it's showing up, whatever level of.
Yeah, so that is a good point, and I did not mean to say that somebody's going to jump into that technique to rid the person of the trauma. I'm glad you brought that up, that oftentimes it is so important to create that sense of safety by increasing recovery and increasing recovery tools and getting that stability before you really work on trauma processes. Now, you talk about something called metabolizing trauma. So tell me a little bit. You've talked about trauma intelligence, but let's talk about what does that mean when you say clients who metabolize their trauma?
So that, to me, is a key skill, is how to metabolize trauma. So let's say, like me, at some point I'm getting into recovery, I'm building a healthy cohort community like you talked about, I'm getting more safe, and pretty soon it's like this frozen places of trauma where I'd immobilized it because it wasn't safe to know about it or deal with it. Suddenly I'm proving to my subconscious protectors that I'm more safe and conscious and sober. So I start to get more recollections of some things that happened to me that are just longing to heal. So it's like if you had a huge iceberg and you thawed it all out at once. Let's say it was in a water bay there and you had a huge iceberg. If it thawed out all at once, it would flood the town, right? It would totally overwhelm the town. So there's a pacing, and Stephen Levine talks about this body-based therapy. Not Stephen Levine, Peter Levine, sorry. Although Stephen Levine's work in meditation is an amazing tool for how to metabolize trauma, is growing consciousness. But it's like just knowing, okay, whatever's down there, if there's things down there in my unconscious or subconscious being stored or whatever, I probably can't heal it all today. I'm going to have to pace myself. And so that is a skill that people can develop, and often with help or coaching or working with somebody that's done it before. But another way I describe it is kind of silly, but metabolizing is a biological word, right? It's to change food into a form that can be used by your body. So metabolizing trauma is to change trauma into a form that can be used by your mind, heart, body, and spirit to thrive. And that, again, is a lot of what post-traumatic transformation is someone takes these experiences that are horrific, and then they hopefully can take them in manageable bites, so you're not having the whole thing overwhelm, and certainly some of that experience is toxic. In other words, trauma is overwhelming and somewhat toxic. So if you were having a food that was kind of bad for you, it's like eating junk food or something. I mean, maybe there's some good in the food and some bad in the food, but your body has to separate out what's the toxic stuff from this traumatic experience, like the shame, blaming of the self, taking it all on, and what's the wisdom building of this experience? What are the nutrients in this experience? Like a waking up, a wake-up call, or coming to terms with that this happens in the world and not living in denial, and then using that wisdom to protect others, like protecting one's children, or being an advocate in the community, or working with others, or just being savvy that what one has gone through. There's a new memoir out called Not My Father's Son, and the author was talking about how just writing the memoir and then having people give feedback is so healing for him, because he realized even though the traumatic experiences with his father were so painful, he used those experiences to reach out and share his story, and then that was healing for others. So metabolizing trauma so that the toxic stuff can be flushed away, and then the wisdom that can be gained in that experience, the character, that then can be used for the good.
Well, that totally makes sense. So, okay, now I think I understand what metabolizing trauma is. And certainly you talked about the 3 phases of post-trauma transformation. But for people that are just now getting their paper together and writing some of this stuff down, will you go over that again?
Oh, sure. Well, so I was talking before about the different kind of internal threat responses in terms of like relational or mobilize or freeze or what I call float as kind of the dissociative stuff. But what I mean by the 3 phases of trauma transformation has to do with it's based on my experience and witnessing kind of a journey that other people go through. And when I was a kid, I used to play board games, and I played the game of life, and and they have these different things. You roll the dice and you go forward. And so it's just an idea of having a framework about what trauma transformation can look like. And there's more info on my website if people want to look at some visuals. It's there. But the phase 1 is what I would call the hell phase, but there's a little O on the end, so the hello phase. And what I mean by phase 1 is that's when the trauma actually occurs, and then somebody's brain adapts in order to handle it. And then oftentimes the result of the suppressed trauma and how they're adapting to handle it becomes a compulsive process. So I would call that distract, where somebody's distracting. They might be self-destructing, and they're trying to protect, but they also are trying to express. And so that's the acting out, the expression. And unfortunately, compulsions tend, as we know, to lead to just very destructive outcomes. And so that phase, if it's not interrupted or shifted, eventually can lead to great suffering and jails and institutions and death. And I call it the hell phase for a reason, and anybody knows who's either been in or witnessed addicts in recovery, it's profoundly painful. But it's often, pain is the touchstone of spiritual growth. It's often the way that people wake up, and that was certainly my experience. And so the next phase of post-trauma transformation, phase 2, is, I just call it the recovery stage or phase. And that's when people are getting into recovery. They're building that beautiful healing support community that you talked about, like the personal village, that the concept of a personal recovery village. There's a Marvin Thomas sort of great book about that. And so then they're starting to get sober, but the frozen stuff from the past, if it's in there, starts to thaw out. And so the skills of the second phase include all the amazing recovery skills that people learn and that we try to help them learn. But also along with that is learning to pace the trauma metabolization. How can they do it in a way that the frozen iceberg doesn't flood the village? And along with that is learning healthy grief skills, because as a layer of trauma starts to unthaw, example for me is coming to realize, wow, my sexuality was really, really harmed. Like, I'm not just a horrific person with a terrible sex addiction just randomly. I went through profound harm. Or it could be emotional harm or whatever harm drives compulsion, but it's just looking at what does that mean, and just grieving, taking time to grieve, and building in a lifestyle that includes internal reflection and expression of emotion and getting support about that. So that, and then the second phase, again, what I found and I see in others, I have a joke with some of my long-term recovery friends, and we say, all the cool kids are in multiple recoveries, you know. I mean, we just laugh about it because the addictive life process is not often just confined to one area. I mean, it can tend to spread as a coping mechanism. So part of the second phase of trauma is recognizing as things are thawing out or grief is coming up, is there a new compulsion taking over? Is there something else that's coming alive as a distract, destruct, protect, express that then needs attention? So an example from my life is I got into sexual recovery and then my finances tanked. I couldn't manage both at one time. And so then I needed to look at, I'm starting to self-destruct with finances, and it's kind of a distraction. And so I needed to add resources in that area of my life. And so that's the pitfall of phase 2 is going back into other addictions or having relapses. And that's why the unhealed trauma really does pose a risk to people in early recovery or doing step work, because that's really unearthing what happened. And so, or chronic relapses even for long-time members, is they get to step 2 or phase 2, but they don't have the trauma pacing skills, they don't have the support, they don't know how to grieve. And so then they relapse, they go back to phase 1. And then just to summarize, phase 3 I call the birthright phase. And that is where individuals are starting to move into what I think is every human being's birthright, which is they have a safe community around them, they've developed visions and goals that they want to go for, and they're going for it in their life. Those outer circle behaviors are happening, they feel cared for and loved. And then they have challenges, because even growth brings with it challenges. And as we know, people can have relapses from positive things happening just like negative. And so it's in having those challenges that sometimes sends people back to phase 2 and having to remember to have healthy grief. But the third phase is just, I call it the bliss phase. It's like really amazing. And so, of course, all of these are just constructs, right? Nobody lives like a board game, and, we can move in and out of the phases. But the idea is having a broad picture of what it can look like and just knowing, well, which phase am I in? What are the rewards of doing all this hard work anyway? And the third phase is really, it's the payoff phase. It is awesome. I mean, that's my experience and what I witnessed around with people I know and people I work with. And so that's what I mean by the phases of trauma transformation.
Well, that is excellent, and I'm so glad you referenced again your website, because I'm talking with Stacy Sprout, and her website is www.stacy, and that's spelled STACI Sprout SPROUT.com, and you actually have on your website 2 visual charts that you're referring to. And they can be found on that website, so people can go to your website, and if they need a little more information, they'll be able to get that from a very well-done website. I mean, you can tell that you have made it your mission to help people work with their trauma and their responses. And as you said earlier, go through the needed steps, including reparenting, to get them into a healthy recovery system that promotes who they are. And that is so important for recovery. That's the essence of recovery. So we don't want anybody to stay, in any way frozen or not do the work they need to do to get better. And so I've got to ask you before we end,
sure.
How would you recommend that someone get started on this path of post-traumatic transformation? What should they do first?
Well, I mean, I would say the very first thing would be to make a commitment to themselves that they are going to do their best to be a loving parent to themselves and stay with the process until they get to that bliss phase, or until they pass on, and not from suicide, because plenty of people with post-trauma symptoms debate suicide as a way out. And so the message is there's another way out, and it does take a lot of hard work. There's no question. It's so worth it. So that would be is just committing to yourself, okay, all right, I'm going to do this. And if somebody else can do it, I can do it. Just getting on one's own team, so to speak. And if that proves impossible, then getting support, and we can borrow hope from other people while we get on our own team. So that would be the first thing. It's just making a commitment to stay alive through this process and see it through. And, for me, I survived extreme trauma and multiple addictions, and there was a time I had absolutely no money, so I couldn't pay for therapy. But there is, I've seen that there it's like there's the life force itself, whatever grows, the trees and the plants and the animates the other mammals, it animates us too. Like, there is a healing force that can be tapped into. And so encouraging people to hang in there until they find it. And there may be some betrayals along the way, or you may grow out of the therapist that you're working with, or you may grow out of something, and that's okay. It's a life process. The other thing I would say, go ahead. Oh, just one other thing is I call it a messy poetic process and not a perfect forensic process. So just 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Like, it's just not perfect. That's how poetry is. But it does speak to our bodies and minds and hearts and spirits, and we can hang in there with it.
Well, and again, you have brought up that all-important being kind and gentle and being patient and knowing that it's a process. And, that's part of working through trauma anyway. Obviously, when people have a recovery system that they're working, they're not going to do it perfectly. Nobody I know does it perfectly, and so it's important to go easy with yourself and to find supportive people, whether it be in the fellowship, whether it be a counselor, whether it be supportive people, to help them do that. So as we end for tonight, is there anything else you want to talk about that has to do with post-traumatic transformation?
I just want to say thank you to you for having me. This has been delightful to talk with you. I feel like we both have just a dedication to wanting to see people heal. I appreciate that about you, and we're all on this journey on this planet, and if there's one thing that connects us, unfortunately, it's survival of losses, and for a lot of us, that's trauma. So it is kind of the human condition to have survived things that have been overwhelming, and so I would just love to see it be part of the human condition to transform that. And so it's great to work with you on that and have an opportunity to put in my 2 cents. Thank you.
Oh, Stacy, you've just been very helpful in explaining what trauma is and how to transform that. And, again, I want anybody that's listening to go to her website, www.stacysprout.com. You can always email me at carolthecoach@AOL.com. I can get you the information, too. She has a lot of good information on her website, and I just hope that we can talk again and go over some more information in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Take good care. Thanks for giving me this opportunity.
Absolutely. Talk to you later.
Okay, bye-bye.
Yes, as you could tell by Stacy's expertise, she really does a fabulous job of working with people who have had this experience, in part because she had the experience. She knows what it's like. She's been there. She's done the hard work. And, boy, look at her now. She is doing what so many of my clients want to do. They want to work that 12th step, and they want to make a difference in other people's life and make it easier. So, again, go to our website. That's www.stacysprout.com. And we are at the end of our show. So thanks for being a part of the show, for listening, for gathering that information. Hope that you find it helpful. And remember, there will only be one of you at all times, so fearlessly have the courage to be yourself and get the help you need. And next week, we are going to be talking with another expert in the field, Jeff Goodman, who is going to be talking about children of sexual addiction. That'll be a great conversation, too. So see you next week. Have a good one.